Does your crankshaft need to be balanced? We get that question a lot. The engines are balanced from the factory. Mr. Randy Neal from CWT is been quoted as saying sometimes the factory has a sense of humor when it comes to balancing your crankshaft. So we balance all of our cranks here at Kill Devil Diesel, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So what we do when we balance a crankshaft is we're simulating the weight of the pistons, the rods, the bearings, the rings, the wrist pin, etc. What we do is there's a formula that we use that factors in 2 times the big end of the rod and 50% of the little end of the rod. The little end of the rod, where the piston, the pin, the rings, etc. are, is reciprocating mass, and so we only use half of that value on a V8 engine, that is. And then we use 2 times the rotating mass, so the big end of the rod. And so we have a fixture here that we'll use for determining, little end versus big end of the rod. And so we have a fixture here that we use that simulates and isolates the weight from the little end of the rod from the big end of the rod, and then we'll switch the rod around to weigh the little end independently from the big end. Then we get a weight from the piston, the rings, the pin, the locks, everything that goes on to that rotating assembly, and we come up with our formula for the bob weight. We then make up the bob weight by adding weights and shims to the scale, to the bob weight. Make sure that we get exactly down to the precise tenths of a gram here to make sure that we're as accurate as we can be. We also go through and make sure all the rods weigh the same, all the pistons weigh the same, all the wrist pins weigh the same. That way everything is what they call blueprinting to make sure that everything is uniform. And so then once we have our bob weights made up, we clamp them to the crankshaft here. Because these engines are externally balanced, meaning there is weight outside of the crankshaft. So there's internal balance and external balance. Internal balance would be a neutral balance dampener and flex plate. So you can see on these, the factory engines have external weight added to the flex plate here. And then the dampener also has extra weight here because they couldn't get the crankshaft to balance correctly by putting all of the weight only on the counterweights. So they added external weight. For competition engines, we have done some neutral balance or internal balance engines where we pull all of the weight, we put a neutral dampener on it. We have a neutral balance fluid dampener that we've had really good luck with for the 6.4s. What we'll do is add a bunch of heavy metal to the crankshaft to pull the weight out of the dampener and the flex plate and keeps all of the weight internal. For the average street car, it's overkill. There's no downside really on the average, street truck, 3,000 or 4,000 RPM to having the weight on the outside. And so then what we do is we simulate, with the dampener, the crank, the simulated weight, bob weight of the pistons, rings, bearings, and locks, and the flex plate. And what we're going to do is spin the engine over, and we'll get a few different spins, kind of like balancing a tire. Our machine here will tell you where we need to add weight or remove weight. So Andy's going to bring this thing up for our initial spin. First, we'll do a slow spin and see how far out we are. Typically the factory is in the ballpark, but they're not perfect. The factory's mass production tolerances aren't necessarily what we would want to send out with our engines. For sure, if you make a change to the weight of the rotating assembly, aftermarket dampener, flex plate, or pistons, rods, etc., then for sure the most correct way would be to rebalance the crankshaft. Once we get our initial spin, we decide whether we need to add or remove weight. It's like a tire where you can just pop more weight all around the outside of the tire. To remove weight, it's pretty easy. We drill holes. We try to drill as few holes as possible. We've seen some cranks that were very, very artistic, very creative, where they were going for like a Swiss cheese motif. We really try to just keep the as few holes as possible or add to a factory hole. When it comes time to add weight, we'll drill. We have a fixture here. We'll put the crankshaft vertically and we'll drill down with the drill in the machine, and we'll drill a hole through the counterweight of the crankshaft, and we'll drill out, let's say 50 grams of the steel crankshaft, and we'll press in, depends on how much we need to add, got different sizes and different weights for different applications. But if we drill out 50 grams of steel, we'll press in 70 grams of, they call it Mallory. It's like a tungsten carbide. It's a heavy metal. We'll press in 70 grams, so therefore our net gain would be 20 grams. And so we'll do that, and then we'll respin again and make sure that everything's within balance. Usually it'll take a few spins to get the crankshaft dialed in from our initial spin to the final spin, but we give a readout with every engine that leaves here from the initial spin and where we started at, where the total imbalance was to where we landed, and that goes with every engine that we ship. Again, it's kind of like a birth certificate for the crankshaft, and we share our documentation with every engine that we ship. So it is really important when you're getting all your fixturing set up for your balance job that the mating surfaces between the flex plate and any spacers, dampeners, etc., is a nice clean surface. If there's a bunch of boogered up, burrs and stuff or dirt, debris on here, that will cause, run out. It'll cause issues, and the balancer is sensitive enough, it'll pick that up. So what we're going to do is make sure that we have everything oriented correctly the way it would be running in the engine. And then we'll give it another spin. You don't want to, or we don't want to anyway, we've seen all kinds of stuff, but typically you'll see factory balancing holes on the dampener. You'll see factory balancing holes on the flex plate, and those are all within a certain tolerance from the factory. So if you go to the Ford dealer or GM dealer and you buy a replacement flex plate, they'll all be, generally speaking, within a certain tolerance. It would be way quicker and easier to just drill the weight out of the flex plate or out of the dampener to get the crankshaft to be in tolerance. We don't do that because now that flex plate is no longer within the factory tolerance, and that flex plate would have to be married to that engine forever. We always want to add or remove weight from the crankshaft directly, not from the dampener or the flex plate. On the 6-liter and 6.4 Power Stroke, for some reason the factory decided it was a wonderful idea to have this rear crank hub on the back of the engine. Ford says never to ever remove these no matter what, or the world will end. We'd take them off every engine, and so far so good. But it is important that if you're having your crankshaft balanced somewhere, that you make sure that it is oriented correctly on the crankshaft. There's some lineup holes, and we can put some information on the website that'll help customers understand how to orient them correctly. But this was spun with the rear hub off a couple of bolt holes. You can see the front of the crank was 170 grams out. The rear of the crank makes 832 grams out. It's like pounds of in and out. So this is, so we're talking in grams when we're measuring rods and pistons, and what that translates to is inches of force. And so you can see here that at 1,000 RPM, the weight here would create a force of 206 pounds. That's every time, every rotation of that engine is going to have a force of 206 pounds. At 4,000 RPM, that's 3,301 pounds of force every revolution. So 3,000 times, 4,000 times a minute. That's 3,300 pounds of force beating on the bearings, shaking the truck to pieces. Obviously, that's, way out of tolerance because the crank hub, wasn't positioned correctly. But even on at 160 grams out, at 4,000 RPM is still 648 pounds. And so what we're going to do is spin this again and get that within tolerance. The reason Ford says not to remove those dampeners is because you would have a tremendous amount of imbalance if it was reinstalled incorrectly. So understand why Ford says not to remove that, and but as long as you mark the way that the hub was oriented on the engine, and again we can put up a graphic on the website, a template to show how to reorient it if you didn't mark it. But if you were to reinstall it incorrectly, you would be hundreds of grams, or thousands of ounce inches, thousands of pounds of force out if it was off, by one or two bolt holes. So when you reinstall that, it's really super critical to make sure. We spun it up once with it with it 180 degrees out to as an example of what'll happen if it's indexed incorrectly. So this is 350 RPM is roughly what your engine, your crankshaft is spinning at this cranking speed, so not even idle. So now that we're closer, we're going to spin the crankshaft up to 750 RPM, and this will take us closer to our final balance number. Watching these things spin at 750 RPM really gives you a lot of respect for what's going on at 4, 5, 6, 7,000 RPM. You can see our 750 RPM gives a little bit closer picture of what we're actually looking at. So we would drill some holes. We would remove some material on this crank. This one doesn't need to have any weight added. If it did need to have weight added, we would position the crankshaft vertically on our fixture here. We would drill and then ream a hole in the counterweight, and we would press some heavy metal into that hole. And then we would take the crankshaft out of that fixture, put it back on the balancing blocks, and spin it again. And pretty much rinse and repeat until the crankshaft is within tolerance. And it would tend to keep a much narrower tolerance than the factory does. Typically, a few grams is enough to give you years of reliable performance. It's important, again, to try and balance the engine with the components that are going to be running on that engine, with one exception. We've seen some kind of comical videos on the internet of people trying to balance a crankshaft with a fluid dampener on it. Had they read the instructions from fluid dampener, they would have been made aware that fluid dampener instructs you not to do that. A fluid dampener, it'll still have your external weight built in, so it has the proper balance, but the way that a fluid dampener dampens the vibrations is it has an inner inertia ring that floats in a viscous fluid, and while it's running, that inertia ring floats around inside of the shell. We've got some good B-roll for that too from the fluid dampener website. Well, in a running engine, you have the dynamics of pistons and rods moving the crankshaft around, and you have torsional vibrations. On the balancing stand, we don't have that, and so the inertia ring will basically just flop to one side, and you'll be chasing your tail until you need to remove 30 grams here, and then add 30 grams over there, and then remove 60 grams over here, and then remove 60 grams there. So you don't want to balance the crankshaft with the fluid dampener on it. You would balance so the same amount of weight, external weight, is going to be the same whether it's a factory dampener, an ATI, or a fluid dampener. And so in that case, you would just use either a factory, or for race car stuff, we'll stick an ATI dampener on it without the rubber isolator rings. And we'll spin the crankshaft up and get our total imbalance, and then in the running engine we stick the fluid dampener on it. And so always important to read the instructions. Fluid dampeners specifically tells you not to use the not to balance the crankshaft with the fluid dampener on there, again because of that inner inertia ring. And so otherwise you pretty much want to use the same components that are going to be on the engine. We don't ever take material from the dampener or the flex plate. Again, those items should be serviceable. If you ever had to replace those items, you need to be able to go to your any part supplier and find a part that fits. Not all aftermarket parts are alike though. So we save every customer's balance job, and so it is if you do have a different flex plate, you have to change the flex plate down the road and you need to call us, we can balance your new flex plate to match the imbalance of your old flex plate or your dampener or whatever you got. So anyway, that's balancing. From here, the crankshaft will go on to polishing, where we'll polish the journals, and it'll go through final washing and be ready for assembly.